Dr. Ethan Caldwell had spent years perfecting his craft, and his reputation at St. Augustine Medical Center was nothing short of legendary. Patients revered him as a miracle worker, colleagues respected his sharp intellect, and hospital executives saw him as their golden ticket to prestige and funding. His surgical hands had saved countless lives. His name was printed in leading medical journals, and he was frequently invited to speak at elite conferences. To the world, Dr. Caldwell was untouchable. But beneath the surface of his meticulously crafted image, he was a man of secrets. Secrets that, if uncovered, would destroy his career, his marriage, and his very existence. Ethan had always known he was destined for greatness. From the moment he stepped into Johns Hopkins University, he excelled in ways few could match. Top of his class, he mastered complex procedures long before his peers, and his confidence only grew with every challenge he conquered. His professors had called him a prodigy, a man who was meant to reshape the world of cardiac surgery. After completing his residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, he was offered a lucrative position at St. Augustine Medical. Over the next 15 years, he became the hospital's most valuable asset. His patient survival rates were unmatched, his precision in the operating room was flawless, and his ability to remain calm under pressure made him a sought-after surgeon in high-risk, high-profile cases. Ethan had a weakness, and it wasn't just for power or wealth. It was women. Over the years, he had carefully balanced his double life. A devoted husband at home, a predator at the hospital. He pursued his affairs with the same precision he applied to surgery, choosing women who were vulnerable, ambitious, or enamored by his charm. His targets were always carefully selected. Younger nurses, fresh out of school, eager to impress the great Dr. Caldwell. Medical interns, drawn in by his experience and charisma. Newly hired doctors who mistook his confidence for mentorship. To Ethan, his power made him invincible. His wealth, status, and reputation shielded him from suspicion. Even when whispers circulated about his infidelities, they were quickly silenced. After all, who would dare accuse the hospital's best surgeon of misconduct? But this time he had chosen the wrong woman. Ava Mitchell had only been at St. Augustine Medical for 3 months before she caught Ethan's attention. At 29 years old, she was sharp, hardworking, and fiercely independent, and naturally warm demeanor made her a favorite among patients. But unlike many of the nurses before her, Ava wasn't naive. She had seen men like Ethan before, arrogant, powerful, and entitled. At first, she ignored his flirtations. The lingering touches, the late-night texts, the invitations to discuss patient cases over drinks. But Ethan was persistent, and soon, Ava found herself caught in his web. What started as harmless flirtation quickly escalated into something dangerous. Secret rendezvous in the on-call rooms, stolen kisses in empty hallways, whispered promises between surgical procedures. Ethan was intoxicating, and for a while, Ava believed she was in control. She had no idea what she was walking into. Ethan had made one critical mistake. For years, he had hidden something far worse than his marital indiscretions. Something that, if exposed, wouldn't just ruin him, it would send him to prison. Because Ethan wasn't just sleeping with these women. He was infecting them. And by the time Ava discovered the truth, it would be too late. Ava Mitchell had always been cautious about workplace romances. She had seen firsthand how they ended, in gossip, heartbreak, or career suicide. Ethan made her feel desired, alive, special. In his arms, she wasn't just another nurse. She was his. But behind the passion, there was always an unease. Ava had noticed how careful Ethan was, how he never spent the night, how he never used his real phone to call her, how he always made sure they were never seen together outside of work. She told herself it was because of his wife, because of the consequences of being caught. But deep down, she knew there was something more. The first time Ava saw Ethan's true nature, it was so subtle she almost missed it. It was a Friday night, and they had just finished a long shift. He had texted her to meet him in the hospital's underground parking garage. When she arrived, he was already there, leaning against his sleek black Mercedes-Benz, a smug smile on his face. They kissed, and for a moment, It felt like everything was perfect. Then her phone rang. It was a text from Dr. Allison Greer, another nurse who had worked at St. Augustine Medical before abruptly transferring to another hospital. Ava had barely spoken to her since she left, so the message was unexpected. Dr. Caldwell isn't who you think he is. Be careful. Her heart stopped. Ethan noticed the change in her expression immediately. What's wrong? He asked, his voice smooth but alert. Ava hesitated. Nothing. Just a message from an old friend. He didn't press, but his gaze darkened. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few weeks, the text from Dr. Greer lingered in her mind. She wanted to ignore it, to believe that Ethan was exactly who she thought he was. A flawed but passionate man who had fallen for her just as deeply as she had fallen for him. But curiosity gnawed at her. Why had Dr. Greer suddenly left St. Augustine Medical? Why had she reached out to warn Ava, despite barely knowing her? What did she mean by Ethan isn't who you think he is? Ava knew she needed answers, and when she finally found them, her world would never be the same. Ava Mitchell couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach since she received Dr. Allison Greer's text message. Dr. Caldwell isn't who you think he is. Be careful. The words repeated in her mind like a haunting echo. She tried to ignore them, to convince herself that Allison was just another jealous ex-lover or a disgruntled employee with an agenda. But something felt off. Ethan had always been careful, always in control. But now, Ava started to notice things she hadn't before. The way he tensed when she asked about his past relationships. The way his charm sometimes felt rehearsed. The way he avoided discussing certain topics. She wanted answers, and she wasn't going to stop until she found them. Ava decided to start with Dr. Greer. The next morning, she stepped outside the hospital during her break and searched her phone for Dr. Allison Greer's contact information. They had only worked together briefly before Allison transferred to another hospital, but they had always been friendly. Her fingers hovered over the call button. Would Allison even answer? Taking a deep breath, Ava pressed dial. The phone rang 4 times before a voice finally answered. Allison speaking. Ava hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. Allison, it's Ava Mitchell. From St. Augustine Medical. A long pause. Then, Ava. Her voice was cautious. I was wondering when you'd call. Ava's heart pounded. What did you mean by your message? What do you know about Ethan Caldwell? Another long silence. Then Allison exhaled sharply. Not over the phone, she said. Meet me in person. Tonight. There's something you need to know. That evening, Ava drove to a small coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, as instructed. The place was nearly empty, its dim lighting and quiet atmosphere adding to the tension already coiling in her chest. She spotted Dr. Greer sitting in a corner booth, looking different from how Ava remembered. She looked tired, nervous, almost afraid. Allison barely waited for Ava to sit before speaking. I need you to listen carefully, she said, leaning in. I left St. Augustine because of Ethan. Ava stiffened. What do you mean? Allison swallowed. I had an affair with him, just like you. Ava's breath hitched. Just like you. She tried to keep her face neutral, but the guilt burned inside her. I thought it was just an affair, Allison continued, her voice lower now, until I found out the truth. Ava's hands curled into fists under the table. The truth about what? Allison's expression darkened. He's sick, Ava. Ava's body went cold. What do you mean, sick? Allison leaned closer. Ethan has HIV. Ava felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She couldn't breathe. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's impossible. I wish it was. Allison's eyes filled with something between anger and pity. I tested positive 2 months after I ended things with him. Ava's pulse pounded in her ears. This had to be a lie, a misunderstanding, some kind of mistake. I confronted him, Allison said. He denied everything, swore I must have gotten it from someone else. But I hadn't been with anyone else. And when I started asking too many questions, he made my life hell. He spread rumors. He made me look incompetent. He pushed me out of St. Augustine. Ava felt like she might be sick. You need to get tested, Allison said urgently. And you need to get away from him. Ava's hands shook as she grabbed her purse. I need to go. Allison nodded. Be careful, Ava. If he finds out, he won't let you go easily. Ava barely remembered driving home. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her entire body was trembling. Ethan couldn't have HIV. Could he? Her mind raced back to every intimate moment they had shared. His carefulness, the way he always insisted on protection, how he never talked about his health. Had he known all along? She needed to get tested. Immediately. And if the test came back positive, then Ethan Caldwell had done something more than just lie to her. He had destroyed her life, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Ava Mitchell had never been so afraid in her life. Her hands trembled as she sat in the small, sterile clinic room, staring at the white walls that suddenly felt like they were closing in on her. She had been in hundreds of medical rooms before, but this was different. This wasn't about a patient. This was about her. A nurse in blue scrubs entered, a clipboard in hand. She smiled softly, the kind of smile meant to put patients at ease. But it didn't work. Not this time. Ava Mitchell? The nurse confirmed. Ava nodded, her throat dry. The nurse sat down beside her. I see you're here for a full STD panel, including an HIV test. Yes, Ava said quickly. I need it done as soon as possible. The nurse gave a small nod. We'll do a rapid test first. It only takes about 20 minutes for preliminary results. If it's negative, we'll still send your blood sample to the lab for confirmation. And if it's positive? Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse hesitated. Then we'll need to do additional testing to confirm. Ava swallowed hard. Okay, let's do it. The finger prick took seconds. A small drop of blood on a test strip. A tiny thing that now held the power to determine her future. And then the wait began. 20 minutes had never felt so long. Ava sat in the small waiting area, her hands clasped together in her lap, her mind racing. She thought about Dr. Allison Greer, about her warning, about every moment she had spent with Ethan. How could she have been so blind? How could she have let herself trust him? Her stomach churned as she thought about all the patients he had operated on, all the people who looked up to him. Did anyone else know his secret? Was she the only one he had done this to? Her breath hitched. Or were there others? The nurse finally returned, carrying a small white envelope. Ava's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. The nurse sat down across from her and exhaled softly before speaking. Ava. Her tone was careful. Too careful. Ava knew before the words even left her mouth. I'm sorry, the nurse said gently. But your rapid test came back positive for HIV. The world blurred. Ava blinked, trying to process the words. She felt them, but she didn't hear them. It wasn't real. Couldn't be real. She let out a shaky breath. There has to be a mistake. I know this is a lot to take in, the nurse said. But we need to do additional testing to confirm the results. The rapid test is very accurate, but not always definitive. Ava barely heard her. Her world was crumbling. Everything she had worked for, her career, her future, her life, had been stolen from her. And there was only one person responsible. Ava barely remembered leaving the clinic or driving home. The next thing she knew, she was standing in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at herself, but she didn't recognize the woman looking back. She wasn't the same person she had been yesterday. Ethan Caldwell had taken that woman from her. And now she was someone else. Someone who wanted revenge. Her fingers tightened around her phone as she opened her contacts and found Ethan's name. Her heart was pounding. Her rage was blinding. She pressed call. It rang twice before he answered. Ava? His voice came through smooth, calm, like nothing was wrong. I was just thinking about you. She clenched her jaw so hard it hurt. You need to come over, she said, forcing her voice to stay even. A slight pause. Right now. Yes. Another pause. Is something wrong? Ava's grip on the phone tightened. Everything was wrong. No, she lied. I just need to see you. Another beat of silence. Then, okay, I'll be there soon. Ava hung up. Her hands were still shaking, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry, and Ethan Caldwell was about to learn just how dangerous it was to betray her. Ava stood in the dimly lit living room, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Now, as she heard his car pull up outside, she steadied herself. This wasn't going to be an emotional breakdown. This was war. The soft knock at the door felt like a gunshot to her chest. Ava inhaled sharply before stepping forward and pulling it open. Ethan stood there, dressed in his usual clean-cut perfection. A fitted navy blue suit, a confident smirk playing on his lips. But tonight, his charm didn't affect her. Tonight, she saw him for what he truly was. Predator. Ava, he said smoothly, stepping inside. You sounded off on the phone. What's wrong? She locked the door behind him. The click echoed in the quiet room. She turned to face him. I went to the clinic today. Ethan's expression barely flickered, but it was there. The brief tightening of his jaw. The subtle shift in his stance. He recovered quickly, forcing a casual smile. What for? Ava's stomach churned. He was still pretending. She clenched her fists. I got tested. Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Ava, if this is about Allison. I tested positive. The words landed like a slap. Ethan froze. For the first time, the smooth, confident surgeon had nothing to say. Ava took a slow step toward him, her voice trembling with fury. How long have you known? Ethan's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Ava let out a bitter laugh. Don't insult me, Ethan. I know everything. I know about Allison. I know about your past. And I know you infected me. His lips parted slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. Ava, you need to calm down. Calm down? She hissed. You gave me a death sentence, and you want me to be calm? He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Look, these tests aren't always accurate. We should. Stop lying. Ava snapped. Did you do this on purpose? Did you even plan on telling me? Ethan's eyes darkened, the charming facade slipping away. You think I did this on purpose? He asked coldly. Didn't you? Ava shot back. Or am I just another one of your victims? Ethan's jaw tightened. He was losing control. Ava saw it. The shift in his posture, the flicker of anger behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being confronted. He wasn't used to losing. She stepped even closer, so close she could see the tension in his muscles. Tell me the truth, Ethan. How many women have you done this to? Ethan's expression finally changed. The mask dropped. A slow, cruel smirk curled his lips. You really want the truth? Ava's stomach twisted. You weren't the first, he said softly. And you won't be the last. Ava's vision blurred with rage. Before she even realized what she was doing, her hand flew across his face. The sharp crack of her slap echoed in the room. Ethan barely flinched. Instead, he slowly turned his head back to her, his smirk widening. Feel better? He taunted. Ava's entire body shook. He wasn't even sorry. He wasn't human. He was a monster. Her breathing was ragged as she took a step back. She needed to get away from him. Now, but before she could move, Ethan grabbed her wrist. The sudden force made her gasp. You're not going to tell anyone, he murmured, his grip tightening. Because if you do, I'll make sure you regret it. Ava's heart pounded. She wouldn't let him scare her. She yanked her arm free and glared at him, her voice shaking but firm. I'm going to the police. Ethan chuckled, as if the idea amused him. And what exactly are you going to tell them? That you had an affair with your boss? And now you're bitter about it? Ava's stomach dropped. He had thought this through. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. They won't believe you, Ava. And even if they do, what good will it do? You can't undo what's already done. Ava swallowed hard, her mind racing. He was right about one thing. No matter what happened next, she couldn't change what he had done to her, but she could make sure he never did it again. Ava forced herself to take a deep breath. She met Ethan's gaze, masking her rage. "You're right," she said quietly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I am." She nodded, lowering her eyes slightly, playing the role of the defeated woman. "You're too powerful. The hospital would never take my side. The police wouldn't care." Ethan's smirk returned. "Now you're getting it." Ava looked up, meeting his gaze with a calm she didn't truly feel. "Just leave," she whispered. "I need time to process this." Ethan studied her for a moment before nodding. "That's a smart choice." He turned and headed for the door, pausing just before stepping outside. "Take care of yourself, Ava," he said, the words laced with mockery. Then he was gone. Ava stood frozen, her body vibrating with rage. She had lied. She wasn't giving up. She wasn't letting him walk away. She was going to destroy him, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. Ava Mitchell had never been one to seek revenge. She had always believed in justice, the kind that followed the rules, the kind that ensured monsters like Ethan Caldwell were held accountable. But that belief had died the moment she saw the positive test result. Now, all that remained was the need to make him pay. And she wasn't going to sit back and wait for the system to fail her. She was going to set a trap. Ava spent the next 3 days planning her next move. She knew going straight to the police wouldn't be enough. Ethan was too powerful, too respected. He had been careful, no paper trail, no obvious victims, no proof. If she wanted to bring him down, she needed evidence. Real, undeniable, career-destroying evidence. And she knew exactly where to start. 1. Digging into his past. Ava had already suspected that she wasn't his first victim. Now she needed to prove it. She started with Dr. Allison Greer. Ava had brushed off the warnings before, but now she saw them for what they really were. A lifeline. After her shift at the hospital, Ava drove to a quiet coffee shop downtown and sent Allison a message. "Ava, I need to talk. It's about Ethan." A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. "Allison, I was hoping you'd reach out. Meet me in 30 minutes? Ava exhaled. This was it. Allison was already waiting when Ava arrived. The older woman looked tired, her brown eyes shadowed with something Ava now recognized as pain. Ava sat across from her, gripping her coffee cup. "I tested positive." Allison closed her eyes for a long moment, exhaling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I tried to warn you." Ava swallowed back the lump in her throat. "You knew, didn't you? About him?" Allison hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Ava's fingers tightened around her cup. "How many?" Allison's expression darkened. "I don't know the exact number, but you're not the first." Ava's stomach churned. She had been right. "He's been doing this for years," Allison continued. "Sleeping with women, never disclosing his status. He's careful, too careful. And the worst part? No one ever fights back. They're scared of him, of what he could do to their careers." Ava clenched her jaw. "That ends now." Allison met her gaze. "What are you planning?" Ava took a slow breath. "I need proof, and I think I know how to get it." Ethan had always been confident. Too confident. He thought she was weak. He thought she wouldn't fight back. He was wrong. That night, Ava sent him a message. "Ava, I've been thinking. Maybe we should talk again." Took him less than a minute to respond. "Ethan, I knew you'd come around. Come over tomorrow night." Ava stared at the screen, hatred burning through her veins. Tomorrow night, Ethan Caldwell would believe he had won. But he had no idea that Ava was about to turn the tables on him. And this time, there would be no escape. Ava stood in front of her mirror, forcing herself to breathe. Tonight was the night. The night she would finally expose Ethan Caldwell for what he truly was. She had spent the last 24 hours preparing, going over every detail, every risk, every possible outcome. This wasn't just about confronting him anymore. This was about taking him down. Ava had 3 key objectives. Get a confession. Ethan was arrogant enough to admit his crimes if he thought he was in control. Record everything. A confession meant nothing without proof. Ensure she got out alive. Because if Ethan suspected what she was up to, He wouldn't let her leave. She checked her phone. The recorder app was already running. She wasn't taking any chances. Ethan's house sat on a quiet street, far from the hospital. Secluded, private, dangerous. As Ava pulled into the driveway, a shiver ran down her spine. The last time she had been here, she had been in love. Now she was walking into a trap she had designed herself. She knocked on the door. Seconds later, Ethan opened it, flashing his signature smirk. "Ava," he said smoothly, "I knew you'd come around." Ava forced a small smile. Not too much, not too little, just enough to make him believe she was still under his spell. "I needed to see you," she said softly. Ethan stepped aside. "Come in." Ava walked inside, the scent of expensive cologne and whiskey filling her senses. Everything was the same. The leather couch, the dim lighting, the soft jazz playing in the background. It was all designed for seduction. But tonight, Ethan was the one being played. "Drink?" he asked, pouring himself a glass. Ava hesitated. If she refused, he might get suspicious. If she drank, she might lose control. She took the glass but didn't sip. Ethan watched her, amused. "So, what changed?" Ava met his gaze. "I don't want to fight anymore." He smirked. Smart choice. She forced herself to sit beside him, every nerve in her body screaming. She needed him to talk. She needed him to slip. Ava swirled the whiskey in her glass. "Ethan, tell me the truth." His smirk faltered. "About what?" "About us. About everything." He chuckled, leaning back. "I don't know what you want me to say, Ava." She swallowed. "Did you know?" "Before we started." Ethan's jaw tightened for a brief second. Then he shrugged. "I knew." Ava's breath hitched. She had him. She kept her voice steady. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan sighed, rubbing his chin. "Because you wouldn't have stayed. And I liked you, Ava. I still do." Her stomach churned. He was admitting it so casually, like he wasn't destroying lives. She gripped the glass harder. "Were there others?" Ethan smirked again. "Would it matter?" Click. The words were captured. It was enough. Ava's heart was pounding. She had what she needed. Now she just had to get out. She set the glass down, forcing a yawn. "It's late. I should go." Ethan's expression darkened. "So soon?" Ava stood, keeping her movements calm. "We'll talk later." She turned toward the door, but Ethan grabbed her wrist. Panic shot through her. He smiled, but his grip was like iron. "You're acting different, Ava." She forced a laugh. "I'm just tired." Ethan studied her, his eyes narrowing. Then his gaze flicked to her pocket, to her phone. Ava's blood ran cold. He knew, and he wasn't letting her leave. Ava's heart pounded like a drum inside her chest. Ethan's fingers tightened around her wrist, his smirk twisting into something darker. He knew. "You're acting different, Ava." His voice was calm, but there was a cold edge to it. "I told you," she said, forcing a chuckle. "I'm just tired." Ethan didn't let go. Instead, his gaze flicked downward, to the bulge in her coat pocket. Her phone. The recorder. Ava tried to yank her wrist free, but Ethan held firm. "What's in your pocket?" he asked, voice low. She swallowed hard. "Nothing." Ethan smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "Lying isn't a good look on you, Ava." Ava's pulse thundered. She had to get out. But Ethan was a foot taller, stronger, and blocking the only exit. Her only advantage? The element of surprise. She willed herself to stay calm. "Ethan, please. You're hurting me." He loosened his grip just slightly. It was all she needed. Ava wrenched her wrist free and drove her knee into his stomach. Ethan grunted in shock, stumbling backward. She didn't hesitate. She ran. She sprinted toward the door, fumbling with the lock. Behind her, Ethan recovered fast. Too fast. She heard him curse. Then the heavy thud of his footsteps coming after her. Ava yanked the door open and bolted outside. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She dug into her pocket, gripping her phone. The recording was still running. She had to get to her car. But Ethan was right behind her. Ava reached her car, but her hands were shaking. She fumbled with the keys. Come on, come on. Before she could unlock the door, Ethan grabbed her from behind. She screamed, kicking wildly, but he was stronger. He shoved her against the car, his breath hot on her ear. You think you're going to ruin me? He snarled. Ava thrashed, but his grip was like a vice. You don't understand, Ethan whispered. You can't win. Then suddenly headlights. Car was approaching from the street. Ethan hesitated for a split second. Ava used that moment to drive her elbow into his ribs. He grunted in pain, and his grip slackened. Ava turned and slashed her keys across his face. Ethan roared, clutching his cheek. She didn't wait to see the damage. She dove into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. Ethan lunged, pounding on the window, but it was too late. Ava jammed the key into the ignition, tires screeching as she sped away. She didn't look back. Her hands were trembling as she gripped the wheel. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in sharp gasps. But she did it. She had the confession, the proof. And no matter how powerful Ethan Caldwell thought he was, his reign of terror was about to end. Ava wasted no time. The moment she reached a safe place, she pulled over and played back the recording. Ethan's voice was clear as day. I knew. You're not the first. Would it matter? Tears pricked her eyes. She had him. This wasn't just a case of medical malpractice. This was a crime. Ava sent copies of the recording to multiple places. The hospital board, the police, a top investigative journalist. She refused to let this be buried. By the time she arrived at the police station, the wheels were already in motion. It didn't take long for the authorities to act. The next morning, Ethan Caldwell was arrested. The moment his mugshot hit the news, more victims came forward. Women who had been too afraid to speak. Women who had been silenced. Now they had a voice. Ethan's trial was a media circus. Prosecutors charged him with intentional HIV exposure, medical misconduct, and multiple counts of assault. The once revered surgeon sat in the defendant's chair, his smug confidence replaced with cold fear. Ava took the stand and told her story. She looked him in the eye and didn't flinch. And when the jury delivered their verdict, guilty, she finally felt free. Ethan was sentenced to 25 years in prison. His medical license was revoked. His name would forever be remembered, not as a brilliant surgeon, but as a predator who finally got what he deserved. It wasn't easy to move forward. The scars, both emotional and physical, would never fully fade. But Ava refused to let Ethan define her. She started speaking out, advocating for victims, pushing for stricter medical ethics laws. Because if there was one thing she had learned, monsters like Ethan Caldwell only thrived in silence. And she would never be silent again. Months later, Ava stood outside the hospital where it all began. The place that had once felt like home. Now it was just a reminder. She had resigned from her job. She had started a new life. And as she took one last look at the building, she felt nothing but relief. Ethan Caldwell was behind bars. Justice had been served. And for the first time in a long time, Ava Mitchell was finally free.